I was the one who told him she was coming. I thought it only fair to warn him, given what our grandmother had done. My brother Richard, his Grace, the Duke of Fenbourne, the most unapproachable man in the whole of the northern counties, and quite possibly in living memory, had been cornered. Not in the way that men of lesser standing get cornered by creditors or scandals or the inconvenient arrival of a long-forgotten cousin. No. Richard had been cornered by 79 pounds of white-haired, lace-gloved, entirely pitiless determination in the form of Lady Euphemia Aldenmere, our grandmother, who had decided, with the serene certainty she brought to all things, that she had found him a wife. He didn't shout when I told him. That was worse. He set down his pen very slowly, looked at the ledger he had been reviewing, and said, "When?" "Next Thursday," I said. "Grandmother has invited her for a fortnight." "A fortnight?" He said it the way a man says the words when he is calculating how many rooms a house contains, and whether any of them lock from the inside. "She is the youngest daughter of a clergyman," I offered. "From Dorsetshire. Her name is Miss Emmeline Hartwell. Grandmother says she is extraordinary." "Grandmother said the same about the armchair she had reupholstered last spring," Richard said, and returned to his ledger. That was the whole of the conversation. I withdrew before he could make me complicit in whatever campaign of dignified frost he was already planning. I should tell you something about my brother, because if you have heard of him at all, and if you move in any society that reaches above the middling sort, you will have heard of him. You will have heard the wrong things. They call him the reluctant Duke, which is accurate in that he did not want the title and does not enjoy society, but inaccurate in its implication that he is cold at the core. He is not cold. He is simply very far removed from anything that does not matter to him, and the list of things that matter to him is short. The estate, the tenants, the careful management of what his father left in disarray, and the dog, a tremendous black hound named Copernicus who takes up most of the library hearthrug and snores during meetings. He had been married once. Her name does not matter, and I won't give it. She chose someone else within 8 months of the wedding, and it was not a surprise to anyone except Richard, who had apparently believed that agreements meant things. He had not spoken of it since, and had refused, with increasing rigidity, every effort to reintroduce him to society's marriage market. Grandmother had been biding her time for 3 years. I had not known she was this close to moving. Miss Emmeline Hartwell arrived on a Thursday morning in a hired carriage that was sensible rather than grand, wearing a gray traveling dress that was perfectly pressed and entirely without ornament. She was not beautiful in the way the season's celebrated beauties are beautiful. She was not arranged for effect, was not pale in a fashionable way, or possessed of the kind of high color that painters prefer. She had a quality that I noticed only after looking at her for a moment. She was entirely at ease. Not bold, not forward, simply unhurried. She took in the entrance hall of Fenbourne Park with its high ceilings and its portraits of disapproving ancestors with the same composed attention she might have given a pleasant walk. Grandmother met her with both hands outstretched and an expression of triumph so poorly disguised that I had to look away. Richard did not come down for the welcome. I found him in the east study, which he had chosen specifically because it was the room farthest from the entrance hall. "She has arrived," I told him. "I know. She seems—" "I have estate correspondence," he said. He did not come to dinner. This was so extraordinary a breach of conduct. My brother, whatever his feelings, was a man of form, that even grandmother's composure flickered. She covered it within a breath, turning the conversation at the table to a discussion of the late frost and what it had done to the kitchen garden. Miss Hartwell, rather than performing the wide-eyed admiration of a young woman determined to make an impression, engaged with this subject with what I can only describe as genuine interest. She had, it emerged, some knowledge of soil conditions. Her father's rectory garden had been her project for 6 years. "The clay content here will hold moisture longer than you'd expect," she said, addressing the head gardener who had joined us informally at grandmother's insistence. "If the beds along the south wall were raised by only a few inches, you'd extend the season by a fortnight at least." The gardener stared at her. Then he nodded slowly, in the manner of a man encountering an unexpected authority. Grandmother at the head of the table looked perfectly serene. She had not said "I told you so," but I heard it nonetheless. The next morning, Richard came down for breakfast and discovered Miss Hartwell in the library. He told me about this later, told me in the flat, judicial way he reports events he is still processing, and I have reconstructed it as faithfully as I can. She had not been browsing. She had not been making a charming display of herself among the books, which is a strategy several ambitious mothers had deployed in the past with daughters of varying commitment. She was sitting at the reading table in the corner with the large atlas open to a section on the eastern coastline of England, and she was making notes in a small book. Copernicus was asleep at her feet. She did not look up immediately. When she did, she closed the atlas not hurriedly but neatly and said, "Good morning, Your Grace. I hope I haven't claimed your usual chair." He had not been going for his usual chair. He had been going for the atlas, as it happened, which made the moment more awkward than either of them addressed. "You're welcome to the library," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Your map collection is exceptional. I was looking at the tidal inlet work near Fenbourne village. I'd read that there were plans for a sea wall some years ago, and I was curious whether the geography supported it." There was a pause. "There were plans," he said slowly. "They were abandoned. The commission found the inlet mouth too variable." "That seems right," she said, returning her attention to her notes. "The range is too wide." But if they had channeled the secondary runoff, this passage here, she indicated something in her notes without showing it to him, the variance would have dropped enough to make it viable. It would have protected the lower farmland considerably. He stood in the doorway of the library for another moment. "Where did you study drainage engineering?" he asked. She looked up at him with an expression that might, in a different face, have been amusement. "In the rectory garden," she said, "and in whatever books my father had that were relevant." He left without saying anything else, but I noticed at luncheon that he had come down. He didn't speak to her at luncheon. He barely spoke to anyone, this was his usual mode, but he was there, and he was aware of her, in the particular way my brother registers things he has filed as interesting and is not yet prepared to acknowledge as interesting. I know the look. He'd had it once, reading a report on crop rotation from a farmer in the next valley, and had spent 3 days not thinking about it before riding over to discuss it in person. I gave him 4 days. By the 3rd evening, he had not spoken to her beyond the minimal requirements of shared meals. Miss Hartwell, to her considerable credit, had not pressed. She had not positioned herself in his path, had not engineered moments of connection, had not performed distress or delight for his benefit. She had walked the grounds in the mornings, corresponded with someone in her careful handwriting for an hour each afternoon, joined grandmother for tea with the reliable sociability of a woman perfectly capable of conversation, and in the evenings read by the fire in the sitting room with the serenity of someone who was not counting the hours until a duke noticed her. On the 4th evening, I found her in the estate archive. This was a room that no guest had ever voluntarily entered. It smelled of vellum and lamp oil and had not been reorganized since my grandfather's tenure. She was standing at the long table with 3 ledgers open around her, cross-referencing something with a light frown of concentration. "Miss Hartwell," I said. She looked up. "Lord Edmund." "I hope this is permissible." I asked the steward. He was remarkably relieved to show me in, actually. "What are you looking at?" I asked, coming forward. "The farm records from the lower valley, the ones nearest the inlet." She turned one of the ledgers so I could see. "Your brother mentioned the Drainage Commission, and I wanted to understand what the yields had been before and after the plans were abandoned. The pattern is, I think it's recoverable. The farmland that flooded in the last 3 seasons is showing exactly the signature I'd expect if the secondary channel I suggested were opened." I looked at the ledgers and then at her, and I thought, grandmother did not tell me about this part. "Would you be willing," I said carefully, "to write that up? In some form my brother could review." She looked at me for a moment. "I didn't come here to impress your brother with estate management," she said, not coldly, simply clearly. "No," I agreed, "but the farm families in the lower valley have had 3 difficult years." She looked back at the ledgers. "Yes," she said quietly, "they have." That evening I placed a single sheet of notes, her hand, neat and decisive, on the corner of Richard's desk without comment. I had asked her permission first. She had considered it for a moment and then said, "If it's useful." He found it at 8 in the morning. At 9, he was in the archive. At 9:30, Miss Hartwell came looking for a particular ledger from 1803 and found him at the same table where she had been working the evening before. I was told about what followed by the steward. who had been present briefly before recognizing that he was not needed and retreating. Richard had turned when she came in and said, without preamble, "This secondary channel, where does it run?" And she had set down her things, come to the table, and spent the next hour and a half walking him through it. When I passed the archive at 10:30, they were still at it. The door was open. I heard her voice, clear and considered, and then the particular kind of silence my brother makes when he is thinking hard, and then his voice with a question in it. It went on long enough that the steward quietly brought a tray of tea, set it on the side table, and left without disturbing them. I told grandmother. She received this information with the composed satisfaction of a general who has observed her plan advance to schedule and has no intention of being unseemly about it. "She suits him," she said. "He hasn't said 2 kind words to her," I pointed out. "No," grandmother agreed. "He's been thinking, which is his version of saying every kind word at once, stored up, you'll see." I was skeptical. I had watched Richard not speak to several perfectly acceptable women over the past 3 years. Thinking, in his case, had generally concluded with a polite farewell and a return to the ledgers. But then there was dinner. He came to dinner that evening not as a man performing the minimum requirements of hospitality, but as a man with something to say. He waited. I saw him wait, which is unusual for Richard, who speaks when he is ready and has never in his life adjusted timing for a social room, until the table had settled and then addressed Miss Hartwell directly. "The 1803 ledger," he said. "The flooding notation from November of that year, it records the channel running clear. That's inconsistent with what you suggested last evening." The table had gone quiet. Grandmother's expression was sublime. Miss Hartwell, who had been unfolding her napkin, looked up at him with that same quality of being entirely present. "It ran clear that year because the autumn was unusually dry," she said. "If you look at the meteorological record for the region, 1803 had the lowest rainfall in the valley for that whole decade. The channel wasn't tested." She paused. "Did the commission's survey note the rainfall?" Richard was still for a moment. "No," he said, "it didn't." "Then the commission drew its conclusion from an anomalous year," she said. "That's the most likely explanation for why the numbers seem to support abandonment." He looked at her, a long, considering look, the kind he gives things he has decided are serious. "How did you find the meteorological record?" he asked. "My father has corresponded with the Dorset Natural History Society for 20 years, she said. "They keep regional weather records going back considerably further. I wrote to him yesterday and asked him to check." There was a beat. "You wrote to your father yesterday?" Richard said. "Yesterday afternoon," she confirmed. "I thought the question worth settling before your steward began any planning." "You assumed," he said slowly, "that the question would be worth settling." She met his eyes steadily. "I assumed you would want correct information before making a decision, if I was mistaken." "You were not mistaken," he said. That was all he said, but something in the room had shifted. I felt grandmother not moving beside me, which with grandmother is a form of motion in itself. After dinner, Richard did not retreat to the study. He remained in the drawing room, a thing he had not done, to my knowledge, in the past 2 years of the house's social life. And he remained with the expression of a man who is not sure where he is, but has decided to stay until he understands it better. Miss Hartwell played the pianoforte at grandmother's gentle request. She played well without flourish, the way she did everything fully and without performance. Richard sat in the armchair near the window with Copernicus at his side and listened, and I watched his face and thought, there you are. It was not a dramatic moment. It was the opposite of dramatic, quiet, amber-lit, the last of the evening's fire going low, and the music unhurried. But something in my brother's expression had opened, just slightly, the way a window opens on the first genuinely warm morning of spring, not flung wide but undone at the latch. He said good night to her specifically. He addressed it to her, not the room, before he went upstairs. It was 2 words, not 3, and his voice was ordinary, but he had never done it before. I went to grandmother's sitting room. "Well," I said. "Patience," she said, "is the rarest virtue. You should cultivate it." He said good night to her. He did. She put her embroidery down and looked at me. "He'll need a few days. He always needs time to allow himself to want something, since a leaner he believes wanting is the prelude to loss. It takes something very steady to make him believe it might not be. Miss Hartwell is steady, I said. Miss Hartwell, grandmother said, is like a very clean mathematical proof. Every part of her follows from the last with perfect internal consistency. He has never encountered anyone quite like her. He doesn't know yet that that's what he's feeling. He's feeling it. Edmund, she said, picking up her embroidery again. He stayed in the drawing room. She was right, of course. She is almost always right, which I find both reassuring and somewhat destabilizing. The next 2 days were not a courtship exactly. I don't think Miss Hartwell had decided that's what it was, and I suspect Richard was operating under the fiction that it was an extended collegial discussion about drainage. But they were in each other's company for long stretches. He walked the lower valley with her and the steward on the second day, the three of them picking their way along the inlet's edge while she pointed out where the secondary channel had once run and what would be needed to clear it. Richard walked with his hands behind his back and his head down in the way he does when he is listening to something that matters to him, and twice he asked her to stop and repeat a point, and then stood for a moment in the particular silence he uses to fix things in his mind. She treated him entirely without deference. She was not rude, she was never rude, but she spoke to him as she would speak to any intelligent person with relevant authority over the situation at hand. Directly, with evidence, adjusting her explanations when she sensed he needed more and not when she sensed he needed less. When he was wrong about the soil composition near the western bank, she said so calmly and gave him her reasoning, and he considered it and agreed. I watched him discover, somewhere along the inlet's muddy edge, that this was a form of respect he had not previously been offered, and that he found it unexpectedly clarifying. It was during that walk, I think, that something altered in the quality of his attention. He had begun the morning watching her in the way one watches any unfamiliar expert, with the particular suspension of judgment that my brother maintains until he has enough data to decide. By the time they reached the far end of the inlet, where the old channel mouth had silted over with 20 years of neglect, he was watching her differently. Not with less assessment, with more, but of a different kind. He was watching her the way he watches the estate itself, with the quiet attention of someone who is beginning to understand something's value and is being careful not to disturb it while he does. She crouched at the channel's edge without ceremony, getting mud on the hem of her skirt, and pressed her fingers into the silt to test its depth. The steward winced. My brother, standing behind her, looked at the top of her head with an expression I had not seen on his face in years. He looked, I thought, as though he had just remembered something he had forgotten was possible. He did not say anything. He rarely says anything when the feeling is large. He offered her his hand to help her stand, which she took without making anything of it, and they walked back along the bank discussing sediment in the manner of two people who have arrived, without noticing it, at the same shore. On the 6th evening I was late coming in from the stables and past the library. The door was open. Richard was at the desk, writing. Miss Hartwell was in the armchair by the window, reading. Copernicus was between them, equidistant, asleep. No one was performing the occupation of the other's company. They simply were. The fire had gone low without either of them having risen to attend to it. The lamp on the desk was the only bright light, casting a warm circle around Richard's work, and beyond its reach the room was soft and dim. She turned a page. He dipped his pen. Outside, the wind was up in the beeches, and neither of them seemed to notice. I have a number of memories of that house from childhood, and most of them have the quality of a place that was always slightly too large for the people in it. High ceilings and long corridors, and the echoing formality of rooms that expected more company than they received. Standing in that doorway, watching my brother sit in lamplight in his own library with a woman reading quietly on the other side of the room, I thought for the first time that Fenbourne Park looked the right size. I kept walking. I found grandmother and said, I think he's in love with her. I know, she said. Does she know? Grandmother considered this with the seriousness it deserved. She knows something has changed, she said. Whether she is willing to trust it is a different matter. She came here under considerable pressure. I was not subtle about what I wanted from this visit, and she is the kind of woman who will not let herself be swept along by something she doesn't trust. What will he do? He'll do what he always does, she said. He'll think for too long and then act decisively. The question is whether he acts before she goes. The fortnight was nearly done. Miss Hartwell was to leave on Saturday. On Friday morning, Richard was not at breakfast. This was alarming enough that I checked the stables and was told he had ridden out early toward the lower valley. By midday, he had not returned. By 2 in the afternoon, Miss Hartwell had finished her last session in the archive, closed the final ledger, and was sitting in the garden writing what I understood to be a letter of thanks to grandmother. She was composing it with the same careful attention she gave everything, and she looked perfectly collected. But there was something very slight, very controlled, in the set of her jaw that told me this was a woman holding a feeling she had decided not to carry out of the grounds. Richard came back at 2:30. He did not go upstairs to change. He came into the garden still in his riding coat with mud on his boots and said, "Miss Hartwell." She looked up. He was not practiced at this. Whatever he had worked out on that long morning ride, the translation of it into speech was clearly costing him something, and I stood far enough away that I was not entirely sure I was permitted to hear it, but the garden is not so large that I had much choice. "The lower valley," he said. "If we open the secondary channel, the work will take the better part of spring and summer. I'd want someone who understands the full approach to be involved in it, to oversee it if they were willing." She looked at him steadily. "Are you asking me to manage a drainage project from Dorsetshire?" "No," he said. He stopped. He looked at his boots for a moment and then looked back up at her, and it was the most unguarded I had ever seen my brother's face. I would very much like to ask whether you might consider remaining at Fenbourne with rather more permanence than a fortnight." She was quiet for a long moment. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I want to be quite sure I understand what you're asking." "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "Which I'm aware is not a graceful proposal. I'm aware also that I have been extraordinarily poor company for a week, that I did not come to dinner on your first evening, and that I have spent the majority of your visit discussing drainage and ledger records rather than anything that might have suggested He stopped. "I find I haven't the words for what I want to suggest, except that I have not wished anyone to stay at Fenbourne for a very long time, and I find that I cannot think clearly about you leaving." Emmeline Hartwell looked at him for a long moment. I held very still. Even Copernicus, who had appeared from somewhere and was sitting at the garden's edge, seemed to have arrested his breathing. "You were dreadful to me for the first week," she said. "I was," he agreed. "You didn't come to dinner on Thursday." "I know. Your grandmother," she said, "is extraordinarily managing." "She is the most managing woman I have ever encountered," he said with feeling. Something shifted in her face. The composure was still there, it would always be there. It was not a performance but a nature, but underneath it, very quietly, something had loosened. "The drainage project," she said, "is it genuinely viable?" "I believe so," he said. "I'd want a second opinion from the Civil Commission, but the principle is sound." "If I were here," she said slowly, "I would want to see it through. I don't begin things and leave them half done." "That," he said, "is among the things I most admire about you." She looked at him for another moment. The late afternoon light was coming in over the garden wall, the kind of pale northern gold that doesn't last long, and it was on both their faces. "Ask me properly," she said. "Not the drainage project, ask me the thing you're actually asking." He crossed the garden, which was not a long crossing, and stood before her. I think I forgot to breathe. I was standing near the garden wall and had no intention of announcing myself, and he was aware of me in the distant way he is aware of everything peripheral when something central is occupying him, which is to say not very aware at all. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and his voice had gone quiet, the particular quiet of my brother when he is most serious. The voice he uses for things he will not take back once he has said them. "I am asking you not for a project, not for an arrangement, whether you would do me the honor of becoming my wife. Whether you might wish to remain here not because the work requires you, but because I would very much like you to stay. I am not simple company, and I know it. But I will not take you for granted. I don't think I could." The letter to grandmother was still in her hand. She folded it slowly and set it on the garden seat. "Your grandmother," she said, "told me when she first wrote to us that you were a difficult man who had been badly hurt and who deserved someone who would not be frightened of his quiet." She paused. "I am not frightened of quiet." "No," he said, "you are not." "I would like," she said, "to see the lower valley in spring." He let out a breath. It was not a dramatic exhalation. It was small and very controlled. But for my brother, it was the equivalent of a man dropping to his knees. "Then you'll stay?" he asked. "Yes," she said, simply in the way she said everything. "I'll stay." I went to find grandmother. She was in the sitting room. She heard my step in the hallway and before I had got through the door said, "Well." She said yes, I told her. Grandmother's expression was not one of relief. It was one of settled confirmation, the expression of a woman who has never seriously doubted the outcome and is now recording it as fact. "Of course she did," she said. "They are exactly alike, and neither of them could see it until they had stood next to something they both cared about. That is always how it works with that kind of person." She picked up her embroidery. "Close the door, Edmund, there's a draft." They were married in the autumn, in the small chapel on the estate grounds, with no ceremony beyond what was necessary and no guests beyond those who had earned the right to be there. Richard stood at the front of the chapel with the particular uprightness of a man who is not pretending to anything. And when Emmeline came in on my arm, because her father had traveled up from Dorsetshire and was seated already, having walked her to the door of the chapel before passing her to me at the threshold, Richard looked at her the way I had not seen him look at anything in a very long time. She looked back at him with the same quality she brought to everything, clear, considered, and entirely present. No performance, no nerves, just a woman walking toward a thing she had decided and at peace with the decision. It occurred to me, standing there with her hand on my arm, that this was what grandmother had understood from the beginning. Not that Miss Hartwell was accomplished or sensible or possessed of the qualities one lists in the drawing room, though she was all of those things. She had understood something simpler and rarer, that here was a woman who would not fill the silence in my brother's life with noise, but would inhabit it alongside him, that she would make the space feel shared without requiring it to feel different. Grandmother sat in the front pew and said nothing, but I was watching, and when the minister read the vows and Richard said his part in that same quiet voice he uses for things that matter, grandmother's hands, folded in her lap, stilled completely. That is how I knew she was moved. She is not a woman who betrays herself easily. Afterward, walking back across the grounds to the house, she said to me, "You see the difference between a woman who wants the title and a woman who wants the man." "Yes," I said. "Your brother could not see it before, he can see it now." She paused. "He will not lose this, he knows what it is." She was right. She is, as I have noted, almost always right, and on this subject she was entirely right. In the years that followed, through the drainage works that did indeed take the better part of 2 springs to complete, through the reclamation of the lower valley land and the extension of the south kitchen garden and the long winter evenings in the library with the fire low and Copernicus at their feet, my brother did not lose it. He held it with the careful steadiness of a man who has learned, once, what it costs to believe something is secure when it isn't, and has decided this time to build on rock. She suited him. She had suited him from the beginning, which is the thing he required nearly a fortnight to understand, and grandmother had seen in the first 5 minutes of reading a letter from a clergyman's household in Dorsetshire. I did ask her eventually whether she had known from the start that she would say yes. She thought about it in her way, that careful, unhurried honesty, and said, "I didn't know he would ask. I knew by the end of the first week that I hoped he would." And the first week, when he didn't come to dinner. A pause. I thought, here is a man who has decided not to want anything, and I wonder what it would take. Another pause. I found I wanted to be the thing that would take it. I told grandmother this. She listened, set down her embroidery, and said nothing for a moment. Then, that is exactly the right kind of woman. She has never said anything else about it. She doesn't need to. The south garden is extended. The lower valley drains cleanly for the first time in 30 years. And my brother comes to dinner every night and does not wish to be anywhere else in the world. Which is, I think, all our grandmother ever wanted for him, and which is more, I suspect, than he ever thought he would be able to say.